Hey everyone, welcome to yet another installment of the Inside JABA Series. This is number 16, and this, of course, is the Behavioral Observations podcast, which I think makes this technically session 234. In this episode, John Barrera and I are joined by doctors Jessica Nastasi and Nicole Gravina. We discussed their recent JABA publication, Breaks in Productivity and Exploratory Analysis. And I should also note that an additional author on that paper who wasn't able to join us is Isabella Tesistro. And I have a link to that paper in the show notes of this episode if you want to go check it out. And we discuss it pretty thoroughly here as well. And in this episode, we cover quite a bit of territory, including what motivated this particular study, the broader literature on breaks in productivity, the novel research design that was employed, and how the authors analyzed the data. One of the things I also think is pretty cool is if you look at the reference list of this study, it's pretty broad. It goes beyond, it spans everything from the experimental analysis of behavior all the way through the Harvard Business Review and other, the Journal of Applied Psychology and things like that. So it's a great example of looking beyond what we typically do in behavior analysis to really examine this issue. To that point, though, because this is an Inside JABA Series podcast, we did spend some time talking about why this study was published in JABA when other alternatives were available. So I think you'll find this conversation really fascinating. And it would be great to hear some feedback on this if you're a program supervisor and you're trying to set up schedules and things like that. And if you've got some experience in terms of managing breaks and things along those lines, I'd love to hear about it. I should also note that in the coming days, this episode will be available for CEU credit. Of course, Behavioral Observations is an ACE provider. So if you're interested in fulfilling your professional development needs while listening to this podcast or the many others that we have available, go to behavioralobservations.com and click the Get CEUs button to learn more. All right, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without further delay, let's learn about breaks and productivity.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, everyone, welcome to the 16th installment of the Inside JABA series. I am joined by Editor-in-Chief, Dr. John Barrera, and I'm also joined by Jessica Nastasi and Nicole Gravina. How are you folks doing today?
Doing well. How about you?
Doing fantastic. And Nicole, in particular, it's great to have you on the show. I know at the ABA in Boston, that's over a year ago, we talked about doing this. This is way, way overdue. So
it is. I'm happy to be here.
So your patience is definitely appreciated. We certainly talked about your papers before in the Inside JABA series, and so it was great to meet you in person then, and I'm happy to have you on the show here today. So this is a really fun paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm going to read the title here, and then we'll get into some questions about it. So the title is Breaks in Productivity and Exploratory Analysis. And I will also just, apropos of nothing, just also assign bonus points for the brevity of the title. It just kind of gets right to the point and tells you everything you need to know, and is in just a handful of words. So I think that is perhaps a lost art in the academy. I don't know. I'm the outsider here, so who am I to say? But anyway, all that having been said, this is a really great article, and so let's talk about it. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of it and things like that. But just what made you? I guess my first question here is just. I'm always curious about the motivation in terms of why people undertake these studies. So what made you folks want to look into examining breaks in the workplace?
Sure. So I think in answering this question, I'm going to be giving away what a sort of big behavioral nerd I am. Maybe y'all kind of feel the same, but it was in my first year at University of Florida, and Nicole, I don't know if you want to talk more about our system that we were piloting for sort of tracking our own productivity. But Needless to say, I was very focused on maximizing my own productivity. And I knew I had to take breaks at some point, but the behavior analyst in me thought there has to be a way where maybe I could schedule them more efficiently. How long should they be? What should I be doing on them, right? These are just thoughts I was having in my free time. So I dove into the literature. And I found that the Fair Labor Standards Acts, I talk about this, or we rather talk about this in the introduction, they note 5 to 20-minute rest periods can be beneficial to employees. But I wanted to look further into what did the data say, right? And so that's kind of where this started. I don't know if you have comments on that as well, Nicole.
Yeah, I'll just add to this that so we were experimenting with kind of measuring our own performance in lab, but just kind of took this to the extreme. And they were bringing me these graphs that were like, here is, I've worked 80 hours this week and 40 hours of it was on research. And, what should I do to do more? And I was like, no, do less. And so we were sort of having conversations around that too. Like, that's too much, and you have to take care of yourself in this process and not just work, but put other things into your schedule. So that was sort of part of the conversation when we started doing this too.
Right. And I happened upon a research question that needed some additional work, so I jumped into it.
Great. So what do we know about this topic already? And you can maybe tackle that from the context of, or the standpoint of what's in the existing behavior analytic research or what's out there beyond that. So what did you learn about breaks and productivity prior to undertaking this study?
So I'll start with outside of behavior analysis. I think that's where you will find most research related to taking breaks at work. So specifically, I've seen most research centered around breaks as they pertain to well-being. So things like decreased strain. There's been a lot of work in ergonomics. That's where I've seen it kind of furthest back in like the early 90s. Things like reported stress, increased resource recovery at work. That's kind of an IO term that relates to feeling energized or motivated. So I saw a wealth of research in that area, but as it pertains to breaks in productivity, the results were relatively mixed. I saw some research that suggested breaks could improve productivity. I saw other research that suggested there was no relationship, right? And so I thought about our specific methodology in behavior analysis and what could we contribute to that. And so within the field of behavior analysis, to my knowledge, there's no study that focuses on employee breaks, at least that I'm aware of. I will say that we could perhaps draw some parallels in terms of pausing and overall responding on schedules of reinforcement, right? And we have decades of research across species in that realm. But it wasn't really clear whether pausing was functionally alternative to a break, or equivalent rather to a break. So,
and if I may just jump in here, I just want to note for the listeners, you do address that in the article itself. And as a former, kind of undergraduate pigeon mover from one box to another, I definitely appreciated some of the references to the literature in the EAP world. So anyway, please go on.
Yeah, I think that's the majority of it. We wanted to acknowledge that there are some basic behavioral principles that certainly relate to the questions we were asking here, although there were no studies that explicitly looked at employee breaks. So this is relatively novel for our field.
Yeah, there were a couple of pieces from your introduction that were very informative to me as a reader. One was the fact that just allowing people to have these breaks doesn't necessarily mean people take breaks, which I thought was really quite fascinating. You make a potential reinforcer available, the expectation is that it's going to be consumed. But I thought that was a really interesting aspect of your background literature. And the other thing that I thought was interesting, please correct me if I get this wrong, but there's no federal mandate, but there are state mandates. Is that correct?
So my understanding at the federal level is that law is certainly not my area of expertise, so I will caution that there might be some potential misunderstandings in what I know about the Fair Labor Standards Act. But I know that the actual application and enforcement of breaks depends on the type of company, the size of the company, and things of that nature. So I don't know if we could say that all organizations have to provide breaks. And it does, I think, become more of a state level mandate.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so how did you, I want to get into what the experimental question was that you that you examined in the study. So I guess I'll just ask the question directly. How did you come to that? What is it, and how did you come to it? What was missing? What did you want to know more about? And we can certainly get into how you all tackled answering that question. But I'm curious about, okay, what is it specifically that you wanted to look at?
Sure. So I would say that our specific research question in the context of the study was being able to compare performance when there were programmed breaks compared to unprogrammed breaks. So in the article, we refer to that as the experimental session and the control session. And really where that question came from is I didn't see a lot of experimental research related to breaks in productivity, and certainly very few that looked at responding within session. So that was something that we sort of wanted to focus on here. We also could not, we can't force someone not to take a break. We can't force them to stay on task, right? So that's kind of where the comparison of programmed breaks compared to unprogrammed breaks came from.
I see. So what was the research design that you used to explore this question?
So we ended up using an A/B design with random counterbalanced exposure to the order of sessions. So one session being experimental with the programmed breaks, and then the other session being control, where we told them they could take breaks at their own discretion if needed. Did you want like sort of a background on how we came to that, or just straightforward?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Without question. This is why we have these conversations to get into the stuff that's hard to put in the paper itself. But let's talk about maybe let's do this. Maybe what might create a picture in listeners' minds is to describe the task first, and then we can maybe talk about the different groupings and how you arrange those comparisons.
Did you want to take that one, Nicole?
Sure. So the task is actually a task that's been used a lot in OBM research. People call it the check processing task. And essentially what you do is you look at a picture of a check and then you type in the numerical values on the check and hit enter. It's a pretty simple task, but where this originated, it actually came from work that was done by Bill Abernathy, the late Bill Abernathy, who's a brilliant OBMer. And he used to talk a lot about some work he did in monetary incentives. And one of his big success stories was in a bank. And what they tried to do in the bank was get people who were processing checks. Now this is done automatically, but then people actually looked at checks and typed the information in. They were trying to get them to do that faster, because the more quickly that they could get the money in the bank, more quickly they would accumulate interest and they would make more money. And so he had all sorts of great stories about how he would experiment with this to get people to move these checks through faster. So some OBMers then created a similar type of task. And the reason why I think this kind of sticks around in the OBM literature is that it's a task that doesn't require people to practice and learn. Most people could just do it when they, walk in. And so then we don't have to have this period in the beginning where people are kind of practicing and they're getting better at it and that kind of thing. They just walk in and they start doing the task. And so we see pretty steady responding when they use this task.
I see. So that accounts for the learning curve, it removes the learning curve, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I see. All right. So again, I know, just if you don't mind. Okay, so let's walk us through the two different groups again. I know we went through that quickly, but I want to make sure that folks really understand the difference between the two. So you had one group. Or no, how about I not fill in the blanks, and how about I let you guys describe it?
Sure. So there were two groups. The first group was exposed to the control session and then the experimental session. The second group was exposed to the experimental session and then the control session. So that's the counterbalanced exposure. The difference in the actual session, so they were completing the check processing task. In the unprogrammed or control session, we told them that they could take breaks if needed, but otherwise sort of sent them on their way. Prior to that, we had trained them on how to use the task, and we told them to let us know if they needed to leave the room, to use the restroom, or anything like that. So really minimal instructions. During the experimental condition, we let them know that the experimenter would be administering breaks. So the way that looked is every 20 minutes, the experimenter would enter the room, let them know it's time to take a break, and then that break would last 5 minutes where they could do whatever they wanted within reason. They couldn't leave the building. We didn't want to lose them entirely, but within reason, they could do what they'd like. And then at the end of the 5 minutes, we would let them know the break was over and they would continue working. And so that cycle repeated for 4 breaks. And I believe it was 5 periods of work.
Okay. And what was the total, like, I guess, session time, if you will?
Yeah, so it was about 2 hours.
Okay. And so everyone got exposed to one. So what is it that they both got exposed to 2 sessions, the A and the B, or the B and the A? I guess is that how? Okay. Just want to make sure I understand that correctly. All right. Very cool. Did you have any eager beavers who didn't want to like take breaks? Like, no, I'm good. I want to keep, I'm plugging away here. All right.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of questions about the results here. I don't want to jump the gun too much here, but so what do people do on their breaks?
So I think the most common activity we saw was people using their phones. So they reported going on social media, texting, things of that nature. We had someone who so our lab is on the 3rd floor. John, this might be taking you back to being at UF in that dungeon, as we call it. This person would take a walk around the 3rd floor before coming back at the end of his break. We had that one person who took a nap. I was really impressed at that. I'm not someone who can fall asleep easily, but I heard the snoring from the other room and I was like, wow, they did it. They went for it. They sounded like they had a pretty good one, a pretty great nap. A couple of people tried to talk to the experimenter. We gave them sort of neutral responses, but it seemed like that was enough to reinforce some continued conversation for some individuals. I think that's most of the break activities we saw.
And these are undergraduate college students?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Just getting like their intro psych credits or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Jess, I've frequently made that lap, exiting the lab, going around, clearing my head, trying to get myself prepared for the next activity. So it does bring me back. That's great.
Yeah, and just a quick note, there has been some research about the type of activity you do on a break, and I have seen suggestion that physical activity is one task or one activity that might be beneficial for productivity and wellness as well. So you were ahead of the game, perhaps, and so is that other participant.
So what were the? I suppose we've teased the audience enough here, so we've got the idea of how why you did the work, how you did the work, and some just general characteristics of the study. So what did you learn from once you sorted all the data and ran? It's also noteworthy that there's a kind of a between subjects design as opposed to the traditional single case, and et cetera, et cetera. So you do all this work and whatnot. What was the outcome? What did you guys learn from all of this?
So I think the main takeaway is that we saw 75% of participants were more productive during the experimental session. So with the programmed breaks compared to the control session, although responding within session looked different across participants.
Can I ask you about, there's a real neat methodological feature that I don't think that we've had a chance to talk about yet. in much applied work, there's sometimes this consideration of when you have provision of a reinforcer that alters the overall session time during which an individual has to work. So I thought you had an extremely elegant procedural manipulation about how to adjust session time. Could you describe what you did to ensure that the amount of time that the subjects had to work during the experimental session was the same as that in the control session?
Sure. So the amount of time that participants were working was 100 minutes for the control session, and it was technically 120 minutes. It's still 100 minutes, but the session length was 120 to account for that break time. And so Nicole and I think, really sort of debated on whether to hold the total session time constant or the working minutes constant. Nicole, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more about our decision-making process there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing to note is that we probably piloted this for a year before we actually ran the study. And we were going back and forth even in the pilots and trying to figure out what we thought the best solution here was. And I think we just landed on this for the reason that you're talking about. We wanted to make sure that they had the same amount of work time, but we also could see a case for making the session length the same for each. So.
Yeah, I just thought it was a really elegant decision to make, because at least in this first study and potentially a series of studies, you've made sure that the work time is the same. But in our day-to-day lives, I'm sure there are situations in which, for example, in the paper you referenced, some folks might work 9 to 5 and leave at 5. But if you get breaks, you might have a later departure time to accommodate for that. So I think that there are probably advantages to both evaluations, because they might fit different sorts of situations outside of the laboratory or outside of a research context. It was just a really nice place to start in this particular one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aside from the guy falling asleep and perhaps some other things, were there any other kind of aspects of this that you didn't expect or that surprised you? Any interesting stories that perhaps aren't necessarily appropriate for the pages of JABA, but would be noteworthy nonetheless?
Yeah, I think we have a couple. I mean, one you noted earlier, or you asked rather, were there any participants who said that they didn't need breaks or didn't take breaks? And we certainly did have participants who just powered through. During the pilot, we had one participant who completed such a high number of checks that we were a little confused. We were like, how was he physically able to accomplish that? And we came to find out that he was a PC gamer, so a computer gamer. And so perhaps he had some prerequisite skills that really lended to the rate of responding there. So that ended up being a question that we asked after the pilot, is whether or not people played video games, trying to suss out there were prerequisite skills related to typing speed. That's why we added the typing speed test as well. So that was one.
Mm-hmm. There was also the Whistler. Jess, do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah. So we had a Whistler so the way our lab is set up, the participants were in another room. I was in the next room, and I could hear this, really impressive whistling. I'm not someone who has a talent for singing or keeping tune, but this person was really on point. And so, the nerdy researcher in me, I started collecting timestamps for the periods of time where he was whistling. I was like, oh, I wonder if that might alter responding in some ways. And I wasn't able to make that connection with one participant, but it brought up the conversation of sort of adjunctive or interim behavior, just things that people do, perhaps just colloquially speaking, things people do to sort of pass the time. And this participant, when I talked to him about it, I said, wow, after the session concluded, I said, you are a really great whistler. And he said that he had actually been homeschooled. And so he found ways to entertain himself while he was going throughout the day. So just another sort of interesting note there, our whistler as well.
Very cool.
Was the whistling happening during the work time or during the break time or both?
During the work time. And actually, this participant, I believe, did not take unprogrammed break time. If he did, it was very minimal. So who knows? Maybe whistling is part of it.
Whistling at work, right?
I literally just wrote that down on my my notebook here. That's an excellent segue, though. So, what about this unprogrammed break time? That there's this, kind of a separate analysis of that at the end of the paper. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So unprogrammed break time was defined as a response over 1 minute. So the way we measured response time, it was from the point at which the check was displayed to when the check was submitted. And so we went through this process sort of determining how long on average it takes to complete a check, and then like what it would be a reasonable amount of time to suggest, okay, at this point, they're probably no longer typing that string, right? And so unprogrammed break time was simply that time above 1 minute, other than the programmed break time we provided. And so the purpose of measuring the unprogrammed breaks is in the control session, I expected people to take some breaks, to pause to some extent, because 2 hours on this menial task is a long period of time, right? And so I was kind of curious, at least at the inception of the study, if the sort of frequency and duration of unprogrammed breaks how that would interact perhaps with our break schedule. Originally, I thought, maybe I can determine an optimal break schedule based off of their naturally occurring breaks. Because of COVID and our sort of experimental process, we ended up going with something simpler, which was control and then a set schedule of breaks that ended up looking a little different. But I think unprogrammed breaks are particularly interesting because the way I see it, even if you don't provide your employee with breaks, the motivating operations are there, right? And so a lot of times, and we're finding this in a subsequent study that we are writing up at the moment that we can talk about later if there's time. We're finding that if employers do not provide breaks, rather, employees will likely find ways to take them or access the reinforcers that are most prevalent at that time. So that was kind of the purpose of including unprogrammed breaks.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really insightful. So I appreciate you walking us through that.
Thank you.
It kind of reminds me, and try not to get too anecdoty here, but it reminds me of when I was in college, I worked in a retail shop, and some of the staff there were smokers. Some obviously some weren't. Not everyone was, and so it was obviously noticeable when someone went outside to have a cigarette, right? And of course, that engendered all sorts of discussion about the propriety of doing so, the time it takes to do so, and whatnot. And there's also this kind of anecdata of that, sometimes those folks were some of the most productive people and got the most stuff done. And it made me wonder if this kind of this kind of quasi programs break by dint of their smoking habit. And this could be anything, right? Created some level of focus in the non-smoking times and the majority of the time in which they're on the clock. So I don't know if that's something that that's been explored in the literature or not. And again, I'm not going to put you guys. This literally just occurred to me as we're talking about these unprogrammed breaks, but it's something that was it's certainly a curiosity. I don't know if that's something that you guys have seen in your various work lives or not.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I would share something that we just saw in the Harvard Business Review, a paper that just came out about breaks, where they did brain scans of people who were in 4 hours of meetings, and either they took 10-minute breaks between meetings or they didn't, and they saw that the brain Activity was lower if they didn't take breaks during meetings. So when you said focus, that kind of reminded me of that article that maybe we do need those breaks so that we can focus our attention on the task.
Yeah, and this is the anecdotal party, I suppose. But one of the things that I think about is, as I sit in front of the machine where I do most of my work almost every day, I've adopted this approach wherein I keep a little digital timer. I realize computers can do this, but I have a separate digital timer that I set for a duration. And if I set that, I'm less likely to click off of my Word document and onto the news or some other feature of my computer if I know that this break is forthcoming. So I'm very interested in this line of work, and I'm really interested in the things that you do during that break. And you alluded to that a moment ago, Jess. And I think that what you do during that break time seems like as though it may have implications for your focus or your ability to be successful when you get back to it, so to speak. So it would be very cool to evaluate what people are doing during those breaks to see if that has a differential impact on productivity.
Yeah, we do actually have an undergraduate student who ran an undergraduate thesis related to that topic and just helped support him. And we paired up with Meredith Berry, who does work in exposure to nature. Mm-hmm. And so we looked at exposure to nature during breaks compared to looking at built environments. It was an undergraduate thesis, so there's still some things that could be tweaked, and we still haven't looked at all the data, but that was one direction that we were kind of thinking about in terms of activity. And then Jess, as they had alluded to earlier, also was looking at exercise or going for a walk during breaks as well. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we could go with that.
Oh, yeah. That sounds great.
Well, speaking of different ways you can go, what's next on, what do you folks have plans to, you've already kind of, I think, hinted toward this earlier. What's the extension of this? What are some other experimental questions you want to tackle? Using this paper as a jumping off point.
Yeah, so I'll actually go first, and then I'll let Jess talk about the second part of their dissertation. So they have actually extended this in their line of work, but some other things that we've been thinking about are. Does it matter what people do on breaks, like we just talked about? And we've also thought about whether this would translate to more complex tasks and how this would translate. Maybe we'd actually see a bigger difference if we were looking at more complex tasks. And then also one conversation Jess and I have had a lot, we kind of frame this in terms of productivity, but we don't necessarily just care about productivity, right? In the workplace, we care about well-being and we care about stress. And so there's some other measures that we've been trying to add in and look at because ultimately it's not just about like getting the most out of the employees in terms of productivity, but helping them have a good experience at work, and that those two things can happen at the same time. So thinking about some other measures that could be included, and also looking at ideal break schedules. So, might vary by person. It might vary with how fluent you are with the task. So a lot of things that could be in play that would influence what the ideal schedule would be. But I'll let Jess share a little bit. We won't give too many spoilers, but share a little bit about their second part of their dissertation.
Yeah, so I went through a number of different ideas of where to go next with this study. I think that's one of the fun parts about exploratory research is it opens up so many more questions, right? And I actually ended up switching gears in some sense, sort of taking a step back and working on a qualitative study related to RBTs taking breaks at work. And so the sort of line of thinking that preceded this decision was we were thinking a lot about the context under which people do or do not take breaks at work. So some people may have breaks scheduled, but they don't take them. Why might that be? Some people say they don't need breaks. What barriers are there to taking breaks at work? I also wanted to sort of challenge myself as a researcher in expanding my skill set in terms of methodology. And so this is a study that we completed and we are writing up right now. And hopefully we will have it available publicly somewhere. soon. So that's the general gist of the sort of next steps.
Got it. That sounds like an exciting line of research. I'm curious.
That
Go ahead,
really
John.
does. Excuse me, Matt. The idea, and I'm sure this has informed your thinking, but many of us are hearing a lot about the construct we'll refer to as burnout. And as Nicole was suggesting earlier, this is not just about getting more widgets completed or productivity, but overall well-being of your employees. So I see tremendous value in this if you can identify some ways in which the introduction and the encouragement to take these breaks results in a better overall work experience that keeps folks in the workforce for longer and more satisfied with their job. So that's just brilliant. And you're doing that study's completed, you said?
Yes. Yep.
That's wonderful.
Yep. Just defended 2 weeks ago. So that's done. Now we finish writing it up.
Well, congratulations. That's great.
Thank you.
Fantastic. It is interesting because, John, you're right. There's so many discussions happening, at least from what I can see in the field, about how do we create not just a productive workplace, but a workplace where people are, they feel supported. There's an active fostering of well-being and so forth. I kind of got into this in my podcast with John Austin a few weeks ago, and I've got some other shows that we're going to look at that as well. But it's been something I've been thinking a lot about, quite academically, because I don't have employees or anything like that. But it's an interest just because I know it impacts the field because of all the various labor challenges that are, that everyone is facing right now. So I'm curious.
And I would also
go ahead.
I guess I would also say that applied behavior analysts are also caretakers in a lot of ways. And I think that caretakers are probably less likely to take breaks. And they'll say, like, the client needs this, or, I can't take a break. They kind of put the client ahead of themselves. And so I think in our field in particular, breaks is an important conversation for us to have.
Indeed. To that end, I'm curious if you folks have had companies reach out to you to say, hey, come look at this in my location or something like that. I want to optimize, not just productivity, not just, making widgets and things like that. And I don't want to put you guys on the spot if there are, if these are things that, if you're getting, if these are discussions that are not public or anything like that. But I guess more generally, as the organizational behavior management field kind of matures and grows, at the same time, applied behavior analysis, big ABA, if you will, is exploding, right? It's not like it was 20 years ago with just these outposts here and there. But our field is contending with a lot of these personnel challenges. Is this something that you're seeing people reaching out to you for support about?
I would say not yet. I think that the things people reach out for support about are more around like getting systems in place and structure, more performance management still. I think that we're still early in our conversations in our field of recognizing that employee well-being is an important part of those systems to support people and reduce turnover and that kind of thing. So I think that we still have more work to do within our field to see how it interacts. That was another conversation we had when we conceived the studies. When we were like, oh, should we be focusing on productivity? We were like, well, this is something that organizations can look at and say, oh, I can focus on well-being and I can see that productivity will improve or at least not get worse. So I think that there is more to be done in this area. I get a lot of requests, and I think Jess has had requests too, to talk about time management. And so I think breaks can be embedded into time management, but people aren't explicitly asking about how do I give people breaks or even improve their well-being from a consulting capacity.
I see. We'll have to check back in with you in a little bit to see if that changes.
I think it's evolving. It's evolving. Yeah.
Good.
Well, relatedly, I'm wondering if this topic is one that's just, the title is just so succinct and communicates exactly what you found from this study. it seems as though ways to improve productivity and well-being would be of interest to lots of folks. I'm wondering if perhaps you can speak to the extent to which your work has garnered responses, if not from companies, but perhaps in social media or from other professionals or scholars. It seems like it's very clickable to me. I want to know how to be more productive and happier. So can you describe some of that response?
I think I can take that one, Nicole.
Yeah.
So I would not consider myself a social media guru in any way. Nicole and I have talked about how we're both learning to do better at disseminating our work, and it's become a sort of important piece in our lab. So we ended up posting the study on LinkedIn, not expecting much, but it ended up doing really well. I can't remember the exact numbers on it, but it garnered a fair amount of attention, I think primarily from BCBAs and people working in the applied sector, which was really exciting to see people really get sort of passionate and think more about the importance of taking breaks in their own work, right? And so that was really cool to see and sort of unexpected.
Mm-hmm. I think one nice thing about being at the University of Florida is we have colleagues who are really good at disseminating their work. Mm-hmm. And so we get to see what they're doing. And I know we reached out to you, John. We were like, can there be a press release if I can need to? Because, our colleagues in social psychology are really great at that. Their research shows up in the New York Times and that kind of thing. So I think that it did resonate a lot with individuals. And I also think that on our end, we're kind of working on getting better at disseminating our work and seeing what strategies we can use to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if people were excited about this first study, I think the second one will be even more interesting. We've got some really exciting results to share with everyone, so stay tuned for that. Go ahead, John.
Man, the anticipation is too much. You really know how to set this up. I cannot wait to read about that.
Nicole, well done. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Nicole made reference to the Harvard Business Review article, and it just strikes me that you're really tapping your work and the work that's being cited in these kind of outlets that are created for public consumption are really tapping into the same thing. So I think that you're right that our efforts as behavior analysts to make our work consumable for more general audiences, not only that it's in a package that folks can read and interpret and understand, but also that it's getting in front of those audiences. And I think that something like a LinkedIn is more likely to do that than perhaps other sources, but it really does serve as a prompt for many of us, I think, to do better in terms of getting our work in front of more diverse audiences, perhaps not professionals that wherein this work might have an impact. So I'm really excited to see this unfold, and certainly anticipation is high for part 2 of this dissertation portfolio. Really looking forward to that.
Social media and podcasts too.
Indeed. Hey, John, did you have some questions from the editor-in-chief's with your editor-in-chief hat on?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think one that I frequently come to in meeting with such talented scholars and getting to see this work come through the journal is, what made you choose JABA? Certainly, JOBM as an outlet is going to be receptive to this kind of work. We alluded to this earlier. The design was worth a conversation in this podcast because I think it's a little different. So I'm curious if you might be able to describe the steps and the thinking that went into selecting your outlet. I realize there are lots of outlets. There are lots of very good outlets. So the road to JABA would be informative, I think, for some folks.
Do you want to take that, Jess? Or do you want me to? Okay.
You can start.
Okay. I think for me as an OBMer, I find that when we publish in places like JABA, our work is more likely to be read by a wider audience. I love JOBM, and I think it's a great resource for people who want to learn about OBM and OBM research. But I think JABA has been great for us in kind of connecting with a wider audience. And we felt like this was an article that we wanted to share with a bigger audience. You want to add anything to that, Jess?
No, I would just sort of back up the sort of goal of getting to a wider audience, having had experience working in the applied realm for a while. I think there's a lot of practitioners who read Java as well. So really it was trying to get it to a sort of broader audience for sure. And in terms of the design being a little more unique, it's interesting because it was originally intended to include reversals, but during our pilots, we found that responding was different in the first half of the session compared to the second half. So the length of the session, those 2 hours, was really important to include. And then we also had some limitations in terms of, one, attrition concerns, getting people to come back several times for a 2-hour session. And also that we were at the point in this study working with compensation in terms of a credit for students. So we had a limited number of hours to work with. So it was a kind of toss up between finding the most appropriate experimental design and also making adjustments to make it work, given the resources we had.
And I guess another question we could ask is why did we publish within behavior analysis instead of outside of behavior analysis? Because this could have been something that could go in an outside journal. But I think that we felt like, because we included cumulative records, that probably a behavior analytic audience would appreciate that more and understand those more than an audience that wasn't familiar with behavior analysis.
This is great. I have a couple of follow-up questions, if you don't mind. One that occurred to me is something that Nicole said in response. I'm wondering if you said that putting the work in Java makes it more accessible to perhaps a more diverse or larger different audiences. I'm wondering if there are any strategies that you incorporate into writing the manuscript to help facilitate its more wide distribution. Do you think differently or in the way that you're preparing manuscripts to make it more consumable to diverse audiences?
You want to take that, Jess?
I will say that it's definitely something we keep in mind in terms of how we curate the introduction and discussion. And we think about what readers would most be interested in. With Java, we wanted to, if we had published outside of Java, we might have supplemented with some additional research outside of behavior analysis within Java. We really wanted to make that connection to basic principles and our foundation of research, and also try and make connections to practitioners as well. I think we had an anecdote about a board certified behavior analyst and contingencies that might impact whether or not they take breaks at work. So I would say we definitely pay attention to our audience in the way we write. Did you have anything to add, Nicole?
No, I think that was great. I think sometimes when we write up work like this, we do have to provide more context. Like when we included the Fair Labor Standards Act, it probably requires more context than something that people have done kind of similar procedures or whatever before and that have been published in Java. So probably add a little more context to it, but then also make it relatable for that audience, like the BCBA anecdote.
I think that's great feedback. If you can see yourself in the work, its value becomes greater or enhanced. So I think that's great feedback. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is there have been throughout the episode today multiple references to the pilot study or the pilot work. And I don't know if if listeners will kind of have a full sense of what that means. So can you describe, if it's not too lengthy a path, how long this pilot process took? And if you've already highlighted some, but could you highlight a few of the things that the pilot taught you that you incorporated into the study proper?
Sure. So thinking about this question makes me think of, I think it was Skinner's A Case Study in the Scientific Method. Do I have that correct? It's one of my favorite articles of his where he talks about sort of the the research process and how that can evolve sort of organically, if you will. And so the inception of at least the basic idea of the study happened in my first year. That was 2019. And so I submitted rather, a grant application for the Chris Anderson research grant with OBM Network. And so we sort of waited to hear back from that, and then COVID hit. And so I had to adjust my methods. So the pilot actually occurred via Zoom, and that's part of why we ended up moving to a sort of simpler intervention in that we had no programmed breaks. It was something more feasible to conduct via Zoom. And so during that pilot, I actually had participants assigned to 3 groups. One group that had one large break in the middle, one group that had, I think it was alternating 5-minute and 1-minute breaks. And then the other group, it was alternating 1-minute, 5-minute breaks or something along those lines. So originally, I also was trying to look at the temporal location and duration of breaks as well. I will say that our sample size was not large enough to say to definitively conclude which of those schedules was most appropriate, but we did learn that participants preferred the 5-minute breaks more frequently. They said the longer 12-minute breaks were sort of fatiguing, so to speak, and that they had a hard time getting their momentum back after that break. So it was really informative. I'm trying to think about what else we learned. We did see preliminary evidence that the sessions that included program breaks were more productive than those that did not, which led us to our next study. And sort of as COVID was subsiding, we were able to get everyone in person and really sort of tune up our methods a little bit to have a little bit more experimental control. So that was the general process.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I think it's so important because when you land on these very elegant, very tidy procedures, it kind of appears to an outside reader like you just had this epiphany while you were having your breakfast. But the road to a scholarly publication is complicated. And so I appreciate hearing how you did a little extra work to make sure that your procedures were as strong and sound as they could be. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Our lab are ones that we try to do our best to prepare. We get in there, we analyze the data and figure out ways to fine tune and sort of iterate that process. So that's something that Nicole definitely supports, and other students are doing in our lab as well for the studies. It's a fun aspect of behavior analysis too. I think we do that more often.
It is. That's great. I also like to use this as an opportunity to just highlight some nice touches. And I was already very impressed by the study. But one of the things that I wanted to add is I really love the inclusion of this typing task, that you had to ensure that typing speed was not something that was differentially impacting your outcome. So it's just a very elegant procedural manipulation that you made. And the other feature that I wanted to highlight, which I've already addressed, is I really like how you equated the work time. And certainly you can do the next study in a different way, but just really elegant procedural features. So just grateful that that's now in the literature and we can use your work as an example.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to conclude here with giving you folks the opportunity, if there's anything else about the study that we didn't get a chance to ask about. I know we've been picking your brain here for the better part of an hour. So if there's something that you want to communicate to the audience about the study that we didn't get to, I want to give you the opportunity for the last word, certainly. And more generally, if there's other people who are interested in doing this type of work, looking into this, what general advice might you have? So I'll kind of leave it to you folks with kind of perhaps a 2-part question to take us out with.
So I think I would say that one sort of takeaway I'd like readers and listeners to come away with, and it's something that Nicole sort of mentioned here, is that I think this study rather is really cool because we make sort of the business case for taking breaks at work as it relates to productivity. And that was the focus of the study. But really for employers and employees, people who are thinking about scheduling breaks, people who are thinking about managing their own breaks, to think about sort of the broader picture in terms of employee wellness and things. Productivity is important, but also, things like burnout and turnover, those are important for the business case too, but also the well-being of your employees, right? So sort of situating this study in the larger conversation of employee well-being, I think is important. Do you want to take the second half, Nicole?
Sure. So tips for doing this kind of research. Gosh, I think, we've talked through the piloting process, and I think that was incredibly important for us to land where we landed. And I think that if people were going to still work in this area, I would encourage them to pilot their procedures as well, try out some different tasks. As we talked about, the task is a little bit outdated. And so I think kind of updating the task would be a really good next step for people to do in this line of work. And then also just adding in other measures, as Jess was just talking about. We've been trying to add in other measures, but there's things that people can look at related to well-being and not just productivity that I think would be valuable for us in next steps in this research. All right. Any other tips, Jess? Sorry.
I don't think so. I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay.
There's something so interesting about that, in that it's the well-being construct is probably one that behavior analysts don't have a considerable amount of familiarity working with, but certainly it is emblematic of what's been recently termed compassionate care, and not only caring for others, but caring for oneself in this context. So it seems that as though this work is on the precipice of taking us into some very new and important territory. So I really like that focus, and trying to quantify that and to translate that for our audiences is going to be an excellent exercise.
Thank you.
That's a good point to end on. So congratulations. It's a great paper, and I hope the audience goes to check it out. You can go to the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com. I'll have a link to it there. And I look forward to seeing what you folks do next. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.